Right now we have a solution in ASP.NET Core that has multiple projects in it. This solution is taking a layered approach. We have a project for entities which is going to hold all the entities in our application. Right now we just have one entity called account, and it has just two basic properties in it, an account number and account title. Other than that, we have an API layer which is actually serving as an entry point to the system. It has just one controller right now, which is accounts controller, other than another controller which is weather forecast controller, which comes by default when we scaffold this ASP.NET Core's application. So we can go ahead and delete this controller. And then we also have entity within this within the same project. This is added by default when we create an ASP.NET Core's project. So we can also delete this one. We don't need it. So right now we just have one controller, which is the accounts controller, and accounts controller is calling another layer, which is actually a business logic layer. So business logic layer is going to hold all the business logic of the application, and if it is going to call data, it is going to call another layer, which is a data access layer. Right now our data access layer is empty. It has nothing in it, just a default class that gets added when you create this project. And our business logic layer is returning a hard-coded data instead of using any database. So in this lesson, we are going to understand how to incorporate ASP.NET Core's entity framework in order to connect to database and return some data from the database. In order to do that, we will change our entity a bit. Our entity should have a property called ID that is going to serve as a unique key in the database. So instead of creating an ID here, I'm going to create another entity, and I will call it the base entity. And this entity will have just one property called ID. It's going to be a string and ID, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to drive my entity from this base entity. So now basically account has three properties, two are right here and one is coming from its parent. The next step is to incorporate ASP.NET Core Entity Framework Code First. I like the code first approach is that we can focus on our business and our classes and what is the relationship between the classes, and we can focus there as per our business, and our database gets generated from our business domain, the way we have set up our classes. Right now in this lesson we will just have this one class, but in the coming lessons we will be seeing different classes and their relationship between the entities, and then we'll be generating a database automatically based off that relationship. So in order to continue with entity framework, we have a data access layer, and we will put our entity framework DB context and data access kind of logic in this project. Right now, as I showed you earlier, it is empty. So we are going to add entity framework. Add new item. So we are going to go to manage NuGet packages, and we will search for entity framework, and we are going to install entity framework core in our data access project. Now that we have entity framework core installed, next thing we are going to do is, let me just delete this class. Next thing we are going to do is that we are going to add a class called ppbank context, and this class will be actually derived from db context, and this db context is actually coming from ASP.NET EntityFranework Core. This DB context actually represents a session with the database. Since we are using code first approach, so for each entity in our system, we are going to create a DB set. Since we have right now just the account property, so we are going to create a DB set for accounts. Let's resolve this. So now we have our DB context, and we can actually use this DB context to add something to the accounts or to get something from the accounts. Please note that we have not set up any database yet. We are using ASP.NET EntityFranework Core's code first approach, and whatever we are going to set up in the DB context, default database is going to be generated based off of that. So right now there is no database, and of course then there is no default data in it. To have a default data in our database, we are going to override a function in a DB context that is called onModelCreating. So we are going to override this function, and we are going to tell that what should be the data in a particular entity whenever a model gets created on the start. So what we are going to do is that we are going to use the model binder that is coming in as an input to onModelCreating function, and in the entity of account we are going to add some default seed data. So let's do this. We are going to give it some ID. So for ID, we're just going to take a new GUID ID, and then we have account number. For that, we are going to take, let's say, 0001-1001. That's one of the account number, and then another property we have is account title. So we are going to set up that property as well. Let's put in my name for now. So we have one of the properties set up. Let's set up another property. Let's set up another data row, and let's call it 2, and let's call it Jack Jill, just any name for now. So right now what we have is a DB context, which is actually a session with the database. We have mentioned what are going to be the entities that will be used, which will be actually eventually converted to database tables, and then we have set up some seed data, some default data, so that whenever the application is run, we have some default data to play with. In order to fetch that data, we will create a facade layer for each of the property, each of the entity we have, and we will call it a repository. So for accounts entity, we will create something called account repository. And then in this class, we are going to we are going to take DB context as a constructor variable, and we are going to take a local version of it as well, and then we are going to save it here using dependency injection, and later we are going to set up this dependency injection in startup.cs as well. And then we are going to take a dbset property as mentioned before, and we are going to set it to account. Let's call it account set, and of course this is coming from the EntityFranework, the entities project. So we are going to set this context to account. So now we have a connection in our DB context. We have set up a connection to the accounts table in our database, which will be eventually created once we are done with this. So since it's an account repository, it's going to have all the functions that are required in our application to work with accounts. One of the basic function will be to get all accounts. So let's create that function. Public sync. It is going to return a collection of accounts, and we are going to call it get all accounts, and it is going to simply return to this thing. So whatever are the accounts in the system, it is going to return that. Next, we are going to set up a dependency injection in startup.cs for the DB context, which we are taking in as an input. So in our configuration services function of startup.cs, we are going to tell that if somebody will ask you for a DB context, a version of DB context, or instance of a DB context, we are going to give them the instance of the DB context we just BBDB context we just created. So since we already know that this BBDB context is actually derived from EntityFranework Core's DB context. And for a DB context to be mentioned here, we need to install EntityFranework Core here as well. Next thing we are going to do is that we are going to tell our system that we are going to use SQL Server local DB. For that, we are going to set up a connection string, which is going to look something like this. We are setting up a database called bbbank using a local DB, and it's a simply trusted connection, and we have just taken this connection string in a variable called connection. After that, in the services, we are going to tell the system that let's add a DB context, the one we just created, bank context, and then within that we are going to use SQL Server. Now we don't have SQL Server right now, so we are going to install EntityFranework Core SQL Server package as well to resolve this problem. So let's go ahead and do that. EntityFranework Core SQL Server. Let's install that. Now we have installed that, so we were able to resolve this. For another project, I already had this database called bbbankdb, so let's call it bbbankdb2, And let's create this database in our local DB. For that, we will go to SQL Server Object Explorer, and in the databases we are going to add a new database and call it bbbank db2, so that we have this database here right now. So now in our account repository we have stuff like that. We are returning all the accounts. We also have a bbbank context where we are setting up some seed data. We have a startup.cs file where we have a connection string to a local DB file, and then we are telling that we are going to use bb context as our system's DB context, and we are going to use SQL Server to make this connection. Now if we check our business logic, you see that before we were just simply returning hard-coded account values instead of the values which we are returning as a seed. So to replace this hard-coded values, what we are going to do is that we are going to dependency inject account repository in our account services. For that, we are going to take a read-only variable of account repository and call it account repo. To resolve that, we have to add the reference to data access. I already added that, so we added the reference of data access project in our business logic project, and then in the constructor we are going to inject dependency inject this thing. So now this is dependency injected, so we will simply remove these hard-coded things, and we are going to return get all accounts from the repository. And since this was async, it returns an async task, so we are going to await here, and we are going to return a task from here, and it returns collections of accounts, so we are going to convert it into a collection, and we are going to simply return it from there, and we are going to make this method async so that we can await for this method. Next, in the startup.cs we are going to make the dependency injection setting for account repository, so that when system comes here it knows that it has to create a reference of account repository. And now if you see our accounts controller, it is complaining that now accounts repository account service is not a one with a parameterless constructor. Instead it has a constructor that has a parameter, and we are using dependency injection to resolve that. So we are also going to use dependency injection here to resolve this account service, same way we did earlier. We are going to take a read-only account service parameter, and in the constructor of it we are going to dependency inject it. And now instead of creating an instance like this, we are simply going to use the dependency injected instance, and since this is async, we have to do it like this, await. Also note that we are supplying some options to our DB context which goes inside the constructor of DB context, but our DB context does not have a parameterized constructor. So we are going to add a parameterized constructor to our DB context. It is going to take in some options and then call the base of this DB context, and these are the options that will be actually sent from here. So which is actually connection string, and we will be using lazy loading. We will talk about lazy loading later in the project. So now that we have set up this, we want to tell our system that whatever entities we have in our project needs to be translated into database, and whatever the properties that are inside our entities needs to be converted into database columns. For that, we are going to set up something called EntityFraneworks migrations. Before setting up that, we are dependency injecting account services. So let's set up this account service for dependency injection here. Next we will set up EntityFraneworks migrations. To do that, first we are going to install a nuget package called EntityFranework Core Tools. We will install that. Once this is installed, we are going to go to Package Manager console, and we are going to add migration and call it first migration. We have to give it some name. Migrations basically, it is giving us an error that the API project is not referencing this. So let's install this in our API project. So let's try this one more time. Okay, now the migration is added, and if we see the data access project, it has a folder called migrations, and it has this first migration and all the related information mentioned here. It has all the convention and everything set up. Next we are going to update the database using this migration. I misspelled it. It's called update database, but the build is failing. Let's see why it's failing. I mean, it's erroring out a different location. I think we are missing a nuget package. So the design package we added in API is also required here. So this design, Microsoft EntityFramework Core design, so let's install it here. So the missing package was actually Microsoft.EntityFramework Core.relational. I have installed that, and then if we look at the errors, the last one is actually about SQL Server value generation strategy. To resolve that, we just need to install EntityFramework Core's SQL Server as well. So let's find and install the latest version. So now we don't have any errors. We just simply reboot. And it works. Now that the build error are resolved, we are going to update the database. Build was succeeded, and database was updated. And if we navigate to that database, we will see that view SQL Server Object Explorer, we will see that our database bbbank db2 has now a table called accounts. So let's now hit our API. So we will put a breakpoint here at the entry point, and then we run the project. And we are going to call API/account/getAll, which is actually this API/accounts/getAll. When we hit that, it will hit a breakpoint. So this is the accounts layer. So remember, we were working on a layered architecture. So this is an accounts layer. So accounts layer is actually dependency injecting the services layer, and it's calling a function on a services layer called getAllAccounts. So let's F11 into it. Services layer is a layer where it is going to have all the business logic of our application. Right now there is no business logic as such, but the only thing the service layer is going to do is to call the repository layer or data access layer using repository to fetch information from the database. In order to do that, we have dependency injected our repository. So we have 11 here, and our repository is working with DB context, and our DB context is, if we hover over this, we will see that this DB context is actually bbbank DB context, because in our dependency injection we set up that if somebody will ask you for this, you have to give us an instance of a DB context that we created, and we have set it up like this. And now when we F11 into this, it will make a connection to the database. It will fetch the seed data that got added in that particular table using our seed data setting, which we did here. And then it returns it from here back to the service layer, back to the controller layer, and voila, we have our results back from the database.